Subscribe before the truth disappears. The first thing the cameras would have caught, if prison cameras were allowed to show chaos instead of angles and shadows, was the sprint. A man in state gray ran the wrong direction down the second-floor tier, bare feet slapping concrete, one hand clamped over his waistband like he was holding his insides in place. Behind him, boots thundered. 2 officers, then 3, moving fast enough that procedure stopped mattering. The air carried the metallic bite of a fresh alarm and the sour burn of chemical spray, and the whole cell block seemed to tilt into one long, echoing corridor of slammed gates. From the yard, a second siren rose to meet the first. It was the sound the men inside called the weather, because when it came, every movement changed. The runner, an inmate named Cal Kite Navarro, hit the stairwell, clipped the handrail, and nearly went down. He caught himself and kept moving, eyes wide and glassy, like he'd seen something that didn't fit inside the rules of the place. Behind him, an officer barked his number, not his name. Names were too soft for what this was. Down on the ground floor, the day room emptied in a wave. Card tables flipped, dominoes scattered like teeth. Men pressed themselves into door frames, into corners, into the practice posture of not involved. In prison, innocence wasn't a moral position. It was a survival stance. Cal shoved through the laundry corridor, the hottest part of the building, where steam hung low and dampened sound. A cart of folded uniforms waited by the wall, neat stacks that didn't belong to anyone until they did. He passed it without looking. He wasn't here for clothing. He was here for a door. The door stood half-hidden behind a stack of industrial trash bins. Maintenance access, normally locked, always ignored. Cal dragged at the handle anyway, frantic, and for a moment it didn't give. His shoulders bunched, his breath choked into a sharp, panicked whisper. He yanked again. The door swung open. Not because he was strong enough, but because someone on the other side had already unlocked it. Cal froze, just long enough for the cameras to see the change in his face. Relief, confusion, then something like dread. He started to step through. A shadow inside the maintenance corridor shifted. Cal never made it all the way in. His body jerked backward as if the air itself had grabbed him. He stumbled out into the laundry heat, eyes rolling as he tried to focus on whatever had just touched him. There was no blood spray, no cinematic violence, just a sudden collapse, heavy and wrong, like a puppet whose strings had been cut. When the officers reached him, he was still breathing, but barely, and the door behind him was already swinging shut, slow, controlled, as if the building had decided to hide the moment. That was how it began. Not with a trial, not with a confession, not even with a body on a slab. It began with a man called Kite dropping in a corridor no one talked about, and a locked door that had no business being unlocked. In the hours that followed, the prison went into a tight, grinding lockdown. Fluorescent lights stayed on. Meals came cold through slots. Men lay on bunks and stared at cinder block ceilings that seemed to press down lower than usual. A place designed to control time turned time into a weapon. Wait, 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 and let the fear do what batons didn't. But the prison had its own circulation system, separate from official announcements. It ran through vents, through plumbing chases, through glances and gestures that looked meaningless to staff and read like full paragraphs to inmates. By nightfall, the rumor was set. Kite had been running because he'd stolen something. Not money, not drugs, something worse inside prison. An order. An order that had been given and then broken. And in prisons ruled by gangs, where leadership isn't a title, but a function, breaking an order didn't just end a career. It rearranged an entire ecosystem. In places like this, leadership rises the way heat rises off concrete, constant, invisible, unstoppable. The public imagines prison gangs as loud flags and tattoos, as obvious lines drawn between races and regions. The reality is quieter and more practical. Most gang power comes down to logistics. Who controls phones? Who controls pills? Who can move a pack of cigarettes from one unit to another without it being found?
Who can keep a promise when every incentive screams to break it? It is an economy built inside a cage. And like any economy, it demands managers. Marcus Vega arrived at Red Vale State Correctional 2 weeks before Kite collapsed. Marcus wasn't famous, wasn't a legend, wasn't the kind of inmate staff briefed each other about. He was 31, lean in the way prison makes men lean. With straight dark hair he kept short and a stare that seemed permanently calibrated for distance. His paperwork said burglary, probation violation, then a fight that upgraded his stay. Nothing that screamed leader. But the cameras, not the official ones, the ones that lived in the eyes of other inmates, noticed something else. Marcus didn't flinch at noise. When the first yard argument broke out near the pull-up bars, he didn't drift toward it like a spectator or away from it like prey. He adjusted his stance so he could see it without being seen. When commissary day arrived and men crowded around the distribution cart, Marcus didn't push. He waited, watching how hands moved, who got their bags intact, and who discovered a missing item they couldn't complain about. A prison teaches observation fast. Some men learn it to avoid trouble. Others learn it to run it. Red Vale had crews with histories older than the inmates who wore their colors. Some traced their roots to street sets, others to prison-born alliances. Names passed between men like weather warnings. Texas Syndicate, Nuestra Familia, the Aryan Brotherhood. Brands recognized outside these walls, but inside, their presence was less about ideology in the open and more about discipline in the shadows, structure, debt, order. The public heard those names and imagined violence. Inside, the more immediate fear was organization. Marcus's first contact came on a Tuesday morning in the chapel corridor, where the smell of floor wax mixed with cheap coffee from a guard station nearby. A man called Rook walked beside him without looking like he was walking beside him. Rook spoke like he had all day, because in prison, urgency is a tell. "You're Vega," Rook said softly, eyes forward. Marcus didn't answer. Answering too quickly was also a tell. Rook continued anyway. "You got transferred for a fight. You handle yourself." Marcus kept walking. "Handling myself doesn't mean handling anybody else." Rook's mouth twitched, a half smile, half warning. "That's what everybody says before they start." At the next corner, Rook peeled away like they'd never spoken, but Marcus felt the message settle on him like dust. "You've been noticed." By the end of the week, the ask arrived in pieces, never as a single sentence. A soap bar left on Marcus's pillow that wasn't his. A folded note called "A Kite" tucked under a library book he hadn't checked out. A man in the kitchen line turning his tray so Marcus could see a small mark scratched into the underside. A symbol, simple, deliberate. It wasn't a threat. It was a map. The mission wasn't dramatic. It never was at the start. Move a package from laundry to the education wing. Small, quiet, no heroics. If Marcus could do it without drawing attention, he'd have proven not strength, but something more valuable. Control. The ability to make a thing happen in a place built to prevent things from happening. On the morning Marcus took the package, Red Vale sounded normal. Keys, radios, distant shouting that could have been anything. He slid the item, wrapped in plastic, flat and hard, into the lining of his issued jacket and walked like his thoughts were elsewhere. As he passed the laundry corridor, he saw the maintenance door. It looked ordinary, industrial gray, scuffed at the bottom, except for the fact that nothing in prison is ordinary once it has a story. Men had already started avoiding that section of wall as if it were a bad luck charm, a place where a man could collapse without anyone seeing what touched him. Marcus didn't look at the door too long. Looking is how you volunteer for trouble. He kept moving. Halfway to education, the prison shifted.
A sudden hush in the hall. A guard stepping back from his usual post. 2 inmates who'd been talking, falling silent at the same time, their eyes tracking something behind Marcus. The atmosphere compressed, as if the building itself was holding breath. Marcus felt it before he saw it. Someone was walking close. Not staff. The footfalls were wrong for boots. Slower. Intentional. The kind of rhythm meant to be heard. A tall inmate came into Marcus's peripheral view, tattooed hands visible, face calm. There was no rage in him, no theatrical menace, just purpose. Another man moved on Marcus's other side, boxing him in without touching him. In prison, that is how you are told you no longer belong to yourself. "Stop," the tall man said, not loud. It didn't need volume. The hallway had already agreed to listen. Marcus stopped. The tall man's eyes flicked to Marcus's jacket, then back to his face. "You carryin' something." Marcus held the man's gaze. "You askin' or you tellin'?" A pause, measured, like a scale being balanced. Then the tall man spoke again, still calm. "Kite carried something too." That name hit the air like a match. Marcus didn't move. He felt the package against his ribs like a second heartbeat. In another place, it would have been a trivial object. Here, it was a decision. The tall man leaned closer, close enough that Marcus could smell toothpaste and instant coffee. "You don't know what you stepped into," he said. And Marcus understood, in a single cold moment, that the mission he'd been given wasn't a test. It was bait. Minutes later, Red Veil went into its second lockdown in 2 weeks, even tighter than the first. Doors sealed, movement froze. The prison returned to stillness the way a fist returns to a pocket after a punch. That night, long after count cleared and lights stayed on anyway, Marcus was escorted, not marched, not dragged, escorted down a service stairwell that inmates weren't supposed to use. The officer guiding him didn't speak, didn't need to. Marcus's wrists weren't cuffed, but the message was the same. You're going where someone wants you. They stopped at the chapel, not inside it, beneath it. A hatch in the floor, normally covered by a heavy utility rug, sat exposed. The metal was old, edges rusted, bolts welded over, as if someone once decided this space should never be opened again. But the welds had been cut. Fresh marks gleamed under the fluorescent light. The officer stepped back, suddenly unwilling to be the closest one. Marcus crouched and pulled. The hatch lifted with a reluctant groan, releasing a breath of air that smelled like damp concrete and something stale, paper maybe, or old sweat. A narrow ladder descended into darkness. Marcus lowered himself down. The space beneath the chapel wasn't a simple crawl space. It was a room, not built by contractors, built by inmates. A hidden office carved out of forgotten infrastructure, a chair bolted to the floor, a makeshift desk made from plywood, stacks of folded notes bundled with rubber bands, a hand-drawn schedule grid on the wall listing officer rotations with uncanny accuracy. In the corner, wrapped in plastic and tucked like a relic, sat a cell phone, old, scratched, and charged. On the desk, centered like an offering, was a single sheet of paper. At the top, written in careful block letters, was the word succession. Below it, a list of names, crossed out, circled, annotated, like a plan that had been running long before Marcus arrived. And at the bottom, underlined twice, was a name Marcus had never told anyone inside these walls. Not Marcus Vega, but the name from his childhood, the name he'd buried before prison ever touched him, the kind of name only someone with access to his life, not just his file, could know. Above, the chapel sat quiet and empty, a room meant for forgiveness. Below, in the hidden room, the prison's true leadership map waited like a trap already snapped shut. And Marcus realized too late that Kite hadn't been running from officers at all. He'd been running from whoever built this room.
The room under the chapel didn't feel like a hiding place. It felt like an engine room. Down there, the air was cooler, heavier, damp enough to make paper curl at the edges. The desk was scarred with years of use, the chair bolted so it couldn't be turned into a weapon or carried away as a trophy,
Everything had a purpose. Even the clutter looked organized. Bundles of kites tied in rubber bands, a hand-drawn grid of shifts and movements, a small stack of paperback books with their spines cracked of the same pages, as if those pages were a language. Marcus Vega stood still long enough to understand the first rule of that space. Nothing here belonged to one person. It belonged to a system. Above him, the chapel remained what prisons like to pretend they were: quiet, controlled, redeemable. Below, the prison was honest. Below was where decisions turned into outcomes. He didn't touch the phone. Not yet. He picked up the sheet labeled Succession and studied the names, the markings. Some were crossed out with a single clean line: finished, removed, irrelevant. Others were circled hard enough to tear the page. Next to a few were small notes in tight block letters: steady, impulsive, useful, liability. It wasn't a hit list the way people on the outside imagined. It was a staffing chart, a blueprint for continuity. A prison gang survived on one thing more than violence: predictability. Leadership couldn't be loud. Loud got isolated, transferred, buried in paperwork and concrete. Leadership had to be quiet enough to survive lockdowns, shakedowns, and sudden changes in unipolicy. Quiet enough to keep moving even when the leader wasn't moving at all. Marcus's eyes returned to the bottom of the page, to the underlined name, the one from his childhood, the one he hadn't used since he was a kid, long before courtrooms and state gray, long before he learned how a place like Red Veil compressed men into numbers. Someone had reached back into his life and pulled that name forward like a hook. The ladder creaked above him. He looked up, expecting a face, an explanation, anything that could make the moment fit into a simple story. Instead, a small object dropped into the room and landed on the desk with a soft slap. A single domino. Not a note, not a weapon, just a domino. White and scuffed, with 6 pips on one end and 1 on the other. Marcus's breath tightened as he stared at it. A code, not for outsiders, but for anyone fluent in prison time. 6-1, Unit 6, Cell 1, or 6:10 p.m., or simply, you are being counted. Then the hatch above him eased shut again, slow and careful, until the strip of light vanished, and the room returned to the hum of its own secrets. Marcus didn't sleep that night. In Red Veil, sleep was never guaranteed, but this was different. This was urgency wrapped in silence. The next morning, a new rhythm settled into the housing unit. It was the rhythm of attention. Men who had never looked Marcus's way before now looked too long. Conversations cut off when he approached. On the tier, a pair of inmates played cards with empty hands. No deck, no chips, just finger movements and facial cues, practicing the habit of communicating without saying anything worth writing down. In the day room, the television played a morning show nobody watched. The real broadcast ran through small motions: a towel hung from a bunk rail in a certain way, a book placed upside down on a table, a commissary bag folded and refolded until it sat at a precise angle. By lunch, Marcus saw Rook again. Rook slid into line a few places behind him, close enough to speak without turning it into a scene. His voice stayed nearly flat, like the words weren't his. "They open the floor," Rook said. Marcus didn't turn. "I noticed. They don't open that floor, not just for anybody." Marcus kept his eyes forward, watching the serving trays move. "Then why open it for me?" Rook's jaw worked once. Behind the calm there was strain. A man like Rook didn't strain unless the ground beneath him was shifting. "Because you're a problem. And if you're a problem, somebody wants to decide what kind." Marcus took his tray and walked. He sat alone, like an animal sits when it knows the pack is deciding whether it's prey or useful. He ate slowly. He listened. The most important lesson prison leadership teaches, without ever announcing itself, is that hunger isn't always about food. Hunger can be about certainty, about position, about who gets to feel safe for an hour. And Red Veil's hunger was waking up. That afternoon, the first disappearance happened. Not a vanishing like the movies, no dramatic escape, no sirens. A man named Lennox, short, talkative, always hovering near the phones, simply didn't return from a work detail. His bunk sat made, his towel folded,
His cup was still on the ledge. At count, his name was read, and nobody answered for him. Staff responded with what prisons always offered before truth: procedure, a search, a pause, a tightening of movement. The unit locked down again, and men lay on their bunks staring at the ceiling while the building pretended it was in control. Inside the lockdown, the prison's other system continued. A kite appeared, where Marcus would find it, tucked into the seam of a library book he hadn't chosen. The paper was thin, folded tight, written in pencil so faint it looked like it might disappear if he breathed on it. Only 3 words: say your name. Not his prison name, not Marcus Vega, the other one, the childhood name underlined on succession. Marcus held the slip, feeling the strange weight of it. In prison, words were currency. A name, especially one pulled from the past, was leverage. He didn't answer. Not on paper. That night, when the unit settled into the restless stillness that passed for quiet, Marcus made a choice that wasn't brave, it was simply inevitable. He went back to the chapel. Not during a service, not during movement, but in the thin gap between scheduled events when the building's attention softened. He moved like somebody who belonged there. Belonging was often just posture. He lifted the rug, he gripped the hatch. This time it opened easily. Someone had made sure it would. Marcus descended and went straight to the phone. It was old, the kind with a screen that wasn't bright, the kind that looked disposable, but it was charged. That meant it had access to power. Someone's access, not his. The phone was a symbol as much as a tool, proof that isolation and rules were negotiable if the right people decided they were. He turned it on. No contact names, just numbers. A few saved drafts in a notes app, not messages, not instructions, just fragments, single letters, date sequences, chapter and verse references like a religious man scribbles. He scrolled and the pattern started to reveal itself. Not a list of crimes, a list of relationships. A verse number corresponded to a bunk location. A date sequence corresponded to a yard rotation. A single letter could mean a person, a debt, a warning. Prison leadership didn't need to shout. It needed to coordinate. Marcus's eyes snagged on one saved entry, a recent one, barely there. 6-1, Kite-Vega, true name. His stomach tightened as he stared at it. A code, not for outsiders, but for anyone fluent in prison time. Not hear footsteps. He felt the change in the air first, like the room had gained another heartbeat. He turned. In the corner, beyond the desk, where the light fell weakly, someone was already down there with him. A man sitting in the bolted chair, calm, upright, hands resting as if he'd been waiting for a bus. His face was half in shadow, but he could see enough to know he wasn't a stranger to the unit. It was the tall, tattooed inmate from the hallway, the one who'd boxed Marcus in without touching him, the one who'd spoken Kite's name like it was a warning. He watched Marcus with the steady patience of someone who didn't fear surprise. "You came back," the man said low. Marcus's throat felt dry. "You wanted me to." The man's eyes flicked to the phone in his hand. Not anger, appraisal. "That name, the one you haven't used in years." Marcus didn't answer. The man leaned forward just a little, enough to move more of his face into the light. "That name," he repeated, "is the reason you're here." Then he reached into his waistband, not fast, not threatening, and produced something small. He placed it on the desk beside the domino. A folded slip of paper, thicker than a kite, almost official. Marcus opened it with careful fingers. It was a printed transfer notice. Not for Marcus, for Cal Kite Navarro. Destination, administrative segregation. Status, medical clearance pending. Kite wasn't dead. Kite was being moved somewhere no one could reach him. The tall man's voice stayed calm as stone. "If you want answers, you say your real name, and you say it to the right person." Marcus looked back at the phone, then at the hatch above, already feeling how small the room truly was. And in the silence beneath the chapel, he understood the trap's final shape. They weren't asking who he was. They were deciding who he was allowed to be.
By the third lockdown in as many weeks, Red Veil stopped feeling like a prison and started feeling like a ship taking on water. Every corridor sealed, every voice lowered, every man listening for the next creak in the hull. Marcus went back to his unit after the meeting beneath the chapel with a new understanding. The question was no longer whether he was being watched. The question was by how many layers. The tall, tattooed man, known in the building as Danner, hadn't threatened him. He hadn't needed to. In Red Veil, a threat was loud. Power was quiet and patient. The next day, Marcus found another kite waiting for him, wedged behind the thin metal of his bunk where only someone with time and confidence would bother to place it. 3 lines, pressed hard enough to bruise the paper. Say it. To the wall. Tonight. The wall wasn't a metaphor. Men called it that because it was what you faced in segregation. Concrete, featureless, forever. The wall was where trouble went to disappear. That evening after count, Marcus was moved without ceremony. No cuffs, no shouting, just an officer at his cell door, a clipboard held like a shield, and a short walk through back corridors where the cameras were fewer and the air smelled like old paint. He was brought to the segregation unit, administrative, not punitive, the kind of place they claimed was for safety. The doors here were heavier, the lights harsher, and the silence had a different texture. In general population, silence was a tactic, and segregation, it was the environment. Marcus was led to a cell with a solid door and a narrow window. Inside, a man sat on the bunk like he was waiting for a meeting to start. He looked older than his file age would have suggested, with a body that had learned how to conserve energy. His hair was cropped close. His eyes were calm in a way that didn't match the setting, the kind of calm that came from consistency, years of being the same person in the same box, while everything outside changed. The man didn't stand when Marcus entered. He didn't introduce himself. He didn't ask questions. He simply said, "Say your name." Marcus understood immediately what they meant. Not the name stitched onto his chest, not the one the officers used, the buried one. He felt it rise in him like something half-forgotten and still dangerous, the way childhood can be dangerous when it returns inside a prison. "Eli," Marcus said quietly. Then, forcing it out like a confession that wasn't meant for forgiveness, he added the full name. The name that had been printed beneath succession and underlined twice. For the first time, the older man's expression changed, barely, but enough. A flicker of recognition, then confirmation, as if a lock had just turned. "Good," the man said. "Now you're real." Marcus kept his posture neutral. "Why is that name on your paper?" The man's gaze held him steadily. "Because this place runs on symbols. You don't lead a prison gang because you're the strongest, not for long. You lead because people believe your decisions will keep them alive." Marcus watched him, waiting. The older man's voice stayed even. "Your name is a key, not because of who you were, because of who it lets people think you are." That was the first twist of the knife. Red Veil had a story it told itself, about lineage, about legacy, about continuity. In a building where men were stripped down to numbers and routines, gangs rebuilt identity out of fragments, a surname, a rumor, a shared city, a tattoo that meant you belonged to something larger than your sentence. Marcus's real name wasn't being used to honor him. It was being used to stabilize a machine. The older man leaned back slightly, as if conserving breath. He said, "There was a leader here before you, not in the way the papers describe, in the way the building behaves. He's gone, transferred out, locked away, doesn't matter. The system he built stayed, but systems need a face." Marcus's mouth tightened. "So you picked mine?" The older man did not deny it. "We picked the name." Above them, somewhere beyond concrete and locked doors, Red Veil continued operating on its visible schedule: meals, counts, movement. Underneath that schedule ran the other one: debt collection, contraband movement, alliances that held until they didn't. A network woven thin enough to slip through cracks and strong enough to survive lockdown.
Kite was the messenger, the older man continued. He found something he shouldn't. He ran. Marcus remembered the laundry corridor, the maintenance door swinging shut like it had its own hands. He collapsed. The older man's eyes didn't flinch. People collapse for a lot of reasons in here. It wasn't an admission. It wasn't a denial. It was the kind of sentence that kept a man alive. "And Lennox?" Marcus asked. A pause. "Removed," the older man said at last, as if describing inventory. He talked too much. He thought phones made him powerful. Phones only make you visible. Marcus absorbed that. He understood now why leadership sometimes lived in segregation cells and still ruled. Isolation didn't kill a system. It purified it. The older man shifted his gaze toward the narrow window in the door, toward the corridor outside. He said, "Danner will handle the muscle. You handle the thinking." Marcus stayed silent. The older man's voice lowered, though it didn't need to. "There's going to be a sweep," he said, "soon, a real one. Not the kind that makes officers feel productive, the kind that empties spots nobody is supposed to know exist." Marcus thought of the room beneath the chapel, the bolted chair, the transfer grids, the phone charged by someone's access, a hidden office exposed now the moment he'd stepped into it. "Someone on staff is nervous," the older man added, as if reading Marcus's thoughts. "Nervous people do things." That was when Marcus understood the full shape of the danger. The gang wasn't just embedded among inmates. It was threaded through routine, through access, through keys, through unlocked doors that shouldn't unlock. "You want me to protect the system," Marcus said. The older man nodded once. "I want you to make sure it survives what's coming." When Marcus was returned to general population, the prison felt different, like the air had been replaced. Men watched him with new caution, not because they liked him, but because the building had quietly told them he now represented something. That afternoon, the sweep began. It didn't arrive with drama. It arrived like weather. Officers moving in tighter formations, doors popping open in sequence, trash bags appearing, mattresses flipped, the tier filled with the sound of metal scraping concrete and shouted instructions. And beneath that official noise was a second, quieter response. Men moving small objects from one hiding place to another, passing items hand to hand in ways that looked like nothing. A distributed system protecting itself. Marcus didn't run to the chapel. He did the opposite. He walked to the chapel in open view during regular movement and stepped inside like he belonged there for prayer. He didn't look back. He didn't hurry. He moved with the calm of someone who had already accepted his part. Down beneath the chapel, the hidden room was gone. Not physically, its concrete still existed, but its contents had been drained. The desk was bare, the bundles of kites were gone, the grid of officer rotation stripped from the wall. Even the bolted chair looked cleaner, like it had never held anyone. Only two things remained on the desk, the domino and a single sheet of paper. Marcus picked it up. One line, written in the same careful block letters. "Leaders don't live in rooms. They live in routines." Up above, boots pounded the chapel floor as officers searched the building around it. They found nothing beneath. No phone, no list, no obvious engine room to blame. The sweep ended frustrated and inconclusive, the way many did. But that night, Red Veil corrected itself. In the day room, commissary flowed again, but through different hands. Phone access returned, but at different hours. Debts were still paid, but the methods changed. Less punishment, more pressure, more denial of privileges, more quiet consequences that didn't attract staff attention. Leadership, Marcus realized, wasn't always a crown. Sometimes it was a steering wheel. 2 weeks later, Marcus was called to intake again. Another quiet walk, another clipboard, another door that shut behind him like it had always been waiting. This time, it wasn't segregation. It was transfer. He was processed in silence, stripped, issued fresh gray, and moved onto a transport bus before dawn. Men on transfers rarely spoke. Everyone knew better than to celebrate. Escapes in prison were temporary. When Marcus arrived at the new facility, the air smelled different, drier, dustier, and the walls were painted a different shade of authority. He was taken to a cell. The door opened, and he stepped inside. On the bunk, perfectly centered on the thin mattress, sat a single domino, 6 pips on one side, 1 on the other. And beneath it, a folded kite with 3 words, pressed hard enough to bruise the paper. Say your name. Marcus stared at it for a long time, understanding what the prison had been trying to teach him since Kite hit the floor in the laundry corridor. Gangs didn't just survive transfers. They were built for them. If you thought this one was wild, wait for the next. Hit subscribe so you don't miss it.